This is the WRDN Morning Farm Report. I'm Brian Winnikins, and joining us this morning, Dr. Paul Mitchell with the Rank Agribusiness Institute at the University of Wisconsin. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Wisconsin Agriculture Outlook Forum that was held recently, and even some good news that was kind of coming out from some of the federal reports on farm bankruptcies. Thank you to our newsmaker sponsors, including Synergy Co-op, Animal Wellness Center of Buffalo Valley, Annabis Silo, Osteoplastics, Compeer Financial, and Elsivia Co-op. Dr. Mitchell, thanks for joining us. Well, for the Ag Outlook, I know we have all kinds of different parts of the industries, from grains, livestock, dairy. So I guess we'll start with the grains. What was the crystal ball saying?
Well, the big issue is prices are expected to remain high, maybe not as high as they have been, but the big issue is, will they stay that high? Demand erosion. There's a lot of concerns about what's coming out of the South American crops and what's going on in China and such. But the other big concern is the cost. The cost of production is really up. UW numbers, over almost 1,100. Some of the numbers out of Northern Illinois are almost $1,200 an acre to plant corn. And beans are comparable, not that high, obviously. But again, the concern really is, sure, we've got high prices, and they maybe not as high as usual or last year, but will these prices stay high enough to justify spending this much money to plant corn and soybeans? That's what's on farmers' minds right now.
Now, because of that, we've been seeing over the last few years wheat making a return. Was there any discussion about that? Well, okay, maybe there's going to be some farmers that are going to say, you know what, we do have a market we can sell wheat to. We're gonna do that for a change.
Yeah, the advantage of wheat is if you're financially constrained, it's a lot cheaper to put it in. If the bank is getting a little nervous about the size of the operating loan they want to give you, wheat is a viable option for some places in the state, and we do have a history. And so, but to be honest, wheat acres are down, and I think it's the high commodity prices that we have seen for corn and beans. And maybe we'd watch. Maybe it'll come back again. We tend to vary. We're not a large wheat state, but it's definitely, we have our Wisconsin wheat belt that goes through the state. And they're also offering crop insurance options for double cropping now with soybeans following wheat. So maybe some people will be bringing small grain like wheat or something like that back into the rotation. And crop insurance options are available. So I guess we'll track the acres and see what happens.
Talking with Dr. Paul Mitchell with the University of Wisconsin this morning. Let's turn to livestock. Recently, at least, we've been seeing just the hog market continues to go down, down, down. Cattle markets have been, but what was the thought on cattle and hogs coming up over the next year?
I didn't follow it that closely, I'll be frank, but I think the worry is, I think you've summarized it. And it's the big concern is there's such a lag in there, and you have to really watch the cattle on feed and some of these numbers. It takes a while to rebuild these herds after they come down. The drought out west is definitely affecting, and people have reduced their herds. And the other big thing I didn't realize and thought about it is there's a shortage of grain in the Western Corn Belt because of the drought. They're shipping a lot of grain from the Eastern Corn Belt to the Western Corn Belt. John Heinberg from Total Farm Management Total Farm Marketing was talking 1 billion bushels. And so there's some really large bases being paid out there on the Great Plains because they need the grains. And so I think that's the big concern. It's just like the grain farmers. Our prices are eroding, and these feed costs are really starting to eat into for these livestock. And that's the big concern there.
And so could them being short on corn and feed, now granted, they're going to probably have a drop in cattle herd numbers, but because of that, is that going to counter then for the corn guy, his concern about the cheap Ukrainian corn and the poor exports? Is that going to counter it along with the renewable fuels part of it,
Yep.
where we might see an increase domestically to help navigate some of this?
Oh, exactly. And that's the confusing part, and why marketing is important. It's high costs for grain, are great for grain farmers. They're hard for livestock farmers because that's the cost of feed. Even if they don't sell it, that's an opportunity cost they're giving up if they feed their grains. And that's always the debate. And so much of these markets, grain, corn, and soybean, it's driven by the export markets as well, and those haven't been quite what they were hoping. They're still a little short in some, and I think we're just waiting to see if China and some of these other our trade partners will pick that slack up. Because if exports are down, that puts pressure on our prices here to downward, because we just don't have we have more grain than we need. We can't export our surplus, and high exchange rates that are high, a strong dollar is part of that problem. And there's just frankly a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen and what is happening in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Talking with Dr. Paul Mitchell from the University of Wisconsin this morning about the Wisconsin Agriculture Outlook Forum that was held recently. Dr. Mitchell, before we started the interview, you had mentioned that on the dairy side of it, Dr. Stevenson was really kind of a downer with what he thought what was going to happen with the dairy markets. Tell us about that.
Yeah, 2022 was a good year. You can see that in the data for dairy. Cash receipts coming into farmers were strong in the dairy industry, up about 35-40% at the national level. And combined, but he was projecting a decrease of $4.5 to $5.5 per hundredweight going into the next year. So basically margins are going to erode strongly. The feed costs are going to remain at a high level, maybe not as high, but still high. And the milk prices aren't going to be there. So that's it. That was kind of it put a little damper on lunch enthusiasm. My message was a little more positive on farm income, but his about the dairy markets was not as enthusiastic, and it did put damper.
Do you remember any specific reason? Was it because of overproduction or a drop in demand or a combination thereof?
Yeah, it's a lot of these factors, and I would encourage the interested audience to get online and watch his presentation. It'll be available probably by, if it's not today, probably next week, Monday or Tuesday. And the slides are available, and you can kind of see, but it's standard stuff. We still have a chunk of our market is exported. These conditions are driving, the export markets matter, for we have to export our surpluses. And so, and then just feed costs and stuff. We tended to we kind of got a little enthusiastic in cow numbers, is my understanding. We're still working through some surpluses on some of the dairy processing products that are more storable. Milk isn't storable very much, but butter is, and cheese is, things like that.
Talking with Dr. Paul Mitchell from University of Wisconsin about the Wisconsin agribusiness or the Wisconsin Agriculture Outlook. Dr. Mitchell, something that was talked about there and is even kind of made some national news as well. Number of farm bankruptcies in Wisconsin. In Western Wisconsin for the last few years had been the 3rd congressional district had been leading the nation in farm bankruptcies, but that's kind of changed from what I understand.
Yeah, Wisconsin as a state, the ag industry has gone through 2 really good years in terms of crop production. Corn and soybean yields were at record, set new records, or tied the record, or just 1 bushel below. Like our wheat yields were 1 bushel below the record. Soybean was 1 bushel below the record we set last year. Corn hit the record we set last year again, 2 years in a row of 180 bushels per acre. So we have high commodity prices for grains. We had high yields in the state. Combining that with good dairy markets margins this last year, farm income in the state is up, and then we had during the pandemic, we had programs just before it, the market facilitation program, and then CFAP 1 and CFAP 2, PPP loans, and there was just a lot of federal money pouring into agriculture to keep the bus rolling, and to where food supply was a real concern. We remember those days of empty store shelves. And so we've had 2 years of good prices, good yields, and so farm income is solid in the state for the average producer, and that shows up as debts are under control. You see that bankruptcy rate is really fallen off. We're no longer lead the nation, which was really nice. We're like 10 is what's active right now as of September 30th. These are Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings. We had hit 76, and back 2 years ago, we had 76 active Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings going in the state, not just the 7th, but both the whole state. And we were 40 some bankruptcies ahead of the next state. That's how far ahead Wisconsin was, more than double the next state. And that's way under control now. We're still in the pack, obviously, but the leading states are at a dozen. And so lots of good farm income situations. And then the farm service agencies kind of had a moratorium on filing bankruptcies during the pandemic. So you kind of have those two factors working together. A moratorium on bankruptcy filings by the federal government for these lenders of last resort. FSA has that loan program, and then just great commodity prices with combined with the large federal payments over the last few years.
So that increase in farm income, the debts, farmers have been really paying down debt with that. So because of that, are you hopeful that, like dairy farmers, they might weather this storm if this is what happens? The corn and soybean farmers are going to weather this storm here because they're in a better financial spot than they have been?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of data out of the 7th District, the Federal Reserve Bank down in Chicago. Dave Oppendal's shop, he runs a nice ag newsletter, and he's got this index of farm portfolios are in, I don't know, in having repayment difficulties. That index is way down, hasn't been this low since 2014. But back in 2020, it was as high as it ever has been since the 1980s. We were just on the verge of a farm crisis if we hadn't had the pandemic and the government payments and the prices that came back eventually. So yeah, the average farmer is in really good shape because of the debt, the loan interest rates. Hopefully a lot of them refinance. I think there's a lot of evidence that they did lock in some of these low rates because interest rates are back up 6% easily for a lot of growers for operating and or land loans. But we've also seen a large increase in land values. We had just a 13.6% increase announced by the USDA in August of 2022. So that helps equity in your balance sheet. So you've got more equity and prices were good. So you got farm income. And so they are entering this time period that looks pretty tight, thin margins, even with these higher prices in grains and the difficulty coming in dairy. They're entering in a solid financial shape. So yes, my hope is they can weather this. And margins aren't going to be as thick as they were, but I think it's a time for grain farmers to put a floor to your prices, and dairy farmers really think about your feed costs and your other costs and how to manage that relative to these prices that are probably not going to be as high as you're expecting.
And that margin protection program, the dairy farmers need to every single dairy farmer should be signing up for that.
Oh, I would definitely encourage it. That program is subsidized to help out. Even if you're a large producer, you still get those early hundredweight. I think it's 5 million hundredweight are locked in at that lower cost and the higher margins. And so it's almost a no-brainer. But farm programs aren't for everybody, and that's fine. That's why it's a free choice. And but I would encourage people to sign up for it.
That is Dr. Paul Mitchell with the Rank Agribusiness Institute at the University of Wisconsin. And this is the WRDN Morning Farm Report.